This video is about another fallacy, and I'm actually going to be interpreting it in a strict sense, a little bit more strict than certain logic or critical thinking textbooks, called begging the question. What we're going to do in this video is the usual 8 things. We're going to talk about what begging the question is and try to specify the meaning of that. We're going to look at the structure of the argument involved in begging the question. We're going to talk about why it's a fallacy, what's going wrong with reasoning or inference or argumentation in this case. We'll examine some common situations in which this is likely to become an issue. We'll then look at 3 specific examples to provide you some ideas about what this looks like when it happens. We'll then talk about how to spot this fallacy, some guidelines, some pointers for that. For those of you who are students who need to be able to distinguish this from other fallacies, we'll talk about what this fallacy typically gets mistaken for. And we'll finish up by talking about how you, if you want to be a critical thinker, can try to, make yourself into the kind of person who's not going to get taken in with this, who's not going to do this with other people, who's not going to fall into this. What sort of dispositions do you need to cultivate? So, what is begging the question? That is a very interesting one right there. I want to point out from the start that this has a few classic synonyms, the petitio principii, the hysteron proteron. You don't necessarily need to know those, although it can be helpful because you think about what they mean. One's Latin, one's Greek. What is begging the question then? So when you're doing that, a claim is being advanced, and the basis for the claim in the argument is simply a restatement of the original claim in some other form. So if we want to put this in other terms, the premises of the argument in some way include the conclusion. It's being smuggled in, right? It's being, brought in under a different guise. So when the premises then are asserted to be true, it looks like the conclusion follows, when really all you've done is said the same thing twice with different words. Often the restatement of the claim will work. There's certain techniques you can use with this through moving from the abstract to the concrete. You change the terminology a bit, or from ordinary language to more technical or elevated language. English is great for this because we have so many words that came to us from Anglo-Saxon and so many that came from French and Latin, and so you just kind of change the etymology and it sounds like you're saying something different. Now, this is a very important point. Despite popular late modern usage, especially on talking head politics shows or culture shows, begging the question is not simply making an unstated assertion or assumption, or leaving some other question open or unanswered. That's not begging the question. That's not what it means in the classic sense. I know that a lot of people say things like that, but those people, at least if we're doing critical thinking, are technically wrong. What they mean is that there's some sort of implicit premise or there's something else that hasn't been answered. So you want to be careful with that. Now let's look at the structure of the fallacy. In this version of it, and I said we're looking at it in a strict sense, right? So it's not including circular argumentation. We're just looking at begging the question. You've got some premise that's we're going to call claim Y. Claim Y is really claim X restated in some other way. The conclusion is going to be, therefore, claim X is true. So you're saying claim Y, therefore claim X, but claim Y is really the same thing as claim X. And one of the possible premises that perhaps a person doing this who's not realizing that they're doing it is, assuming is that claim Y is in some way not the same thing as claim X, when that's not really the case. So the structure of this is extraordinarily simple. You just have claim Y, which amounts to claim X articulated in some different sounding manner, some different way, using different words, and then that's being used to say that claim X is true. Very simple structure when you look at it. Now, why is this a fallacy? I think this is probably pretty commonsensical. A lot of people can see this when we've actually mapped it out. There's no actual ground being provided for why you should accept claim X in the first place. You're just repeating it. It's sort of like saying, well, why should we go to the store? Because we should go to the store. Why should we go to the movies? Well, we should go to the movies. Now, if somebody does it like that bald-facedly, right, then it's very easy to say, well, that's not any reason at all. But when somebody changes it around, then it's a little bit easier to be taken in. What's interesting about this is while there appears to be some sort of structure of argument or inference, there really isn't any, other than just X, therefore X. And if X is the thing that's being called in question, you can't go from the first X to the second X because you don't have the X in the first place. It's not been something granted. So, what are some common situations in which this occurs? I've seen this happen a lot in situations where people either don't realize that the claim is being restated or where it's being done in a manipulative way to try to trick the audience by using different vocabulary. It occurs in a lot of different contexts, ranging from marketing and advertising, we're going to see some like that in just a moment, to politics and policy making. A lot of political discussions, a lot of political speeches, just consist in saying the same thing over and over again, but changing around the verbiage. Education. This is a problem. Often, I actually had a professor one time whose response to being asked critical questions about a particular passage of the text was to go back and then read the text and say, we'll see. So you'd say, look, I think that Foucault is wrong on this because X, Y, Z. And then he'd say, well, let's take a look at that. And there was never any response going on. He thought that simply by restating what he'd said in the first place, that somehow it would just become clear to us and that would deal with the problem. That's really question begging in a certain way, just on a higher order level. Religion. Sometimes people will just restate things, using fancy terminology derived from Latin or Greek or other languages. This is particularly an issue I should have put on there as well in New Agey sort of things where people are talking about auras or, and then they define the aura and it's just, some other verbiage that's being used. Medicine and psychotherapy. This is often a problem. A lot of doctors actually engage in this sort of thing as a way to obfuscate so that patients aren't alarmed, right? They'll just tell you the same thing twice. Psychotherapy can often involve this sort of thing, sometimes where the practitioner, him or herself, gets taken in by their own begging the question. Discussions of aesthetic matters, what's cool, what's not cool, what makes it cool, just restate it in some other way, and that can be an issue. Also thinking about whether something falls within a particular genre or not could be a matter like that when we're talking about aesthetics. Now, let's talk about a few funny examples. I like this one. Why pop music is so popular. I made up this band a while back, if I remember right. Goo Goo Gaga is the hottest new band. They are just killing it everywhere on the charts and record sales and selling out concert and club dates. What makes them so hot, you ask? Everyone wants to play and purchase their music. Fans can't get enough of this stuff. Well, what does it mean to actually be killing it everywhere, to be so hot? It means that people buy their records or buy their MP3s or buy their concert tickets or wear their t-shirts or whatever, right? It's just saying the same thing twice. But it sounds as if you're saying two different things in this case. Let's look at the second example. I call this a bad anti-capitalist argument. There could be reasons to be against capitalism in general or in particulars, but this is not a particularly good argument here. Any sort of market-based system is going to require that some people be involved in productive labor. But productive labor in a market-based economy always entails that goods be produced through appropriating the labor of others unfairly. Therefore, all capitalist systems are necessarily exploitative of the workers' labor. What does exploitative mean? exploitative means that there's some sort of appropriation of the labor, of others unfairly. So it's basically saying, all capitalist systems are exploitative of the workers' labor. Why? Because all capitalist systems are necessarily exploitative of the labor, the workers' labor. It's just saying the same thing twice, and this can often happen when people are using a lot of technical vocabulary. I see this a lot in political philosophy discussions. Here's an interesting one called "Cheater's Gonna Cheat." He's always been of a philandering, lecherous, and duplicitous character. You can't trust anyone who has those qualities to respect the legitimate boundaries and limits of the marital bond. You know he's going to cheat on you. So the conclusion, he's going to cheat on you. And all that other stuff that's been said there is basically saying he's going to cheat on you. He's of a philandering, which is cheating character, right? And duplicitous character. Lying, right? You can't trust anyone to respect the legitimate boundaries and limits of the marital bond. What does that mean? Cheating, right? So it's a whole bunch of verbiage, in the premises being thrown in there to arrive at the same place where you started. He's gonna cheat. It's never been actually, made clear that any of this stuff is in fact true, because it's just X, therefore X. Now, how do you spot begging the question? What should you be on the lookout for? When you're considering an argument, examine the terms that are being used in the argument. Are the terms that are being used in the conclusion showing up in the premises? Some of them should be, because otherwise you don't have an argument, right? You're going to have a non sequitur. But in a restated form that conceals the fact that they're actually the same terms. That's the problem there. You want to watch out for that sort of thing. One way you can do this is by making sure that something additional to what's contained in the conclusion is really being supplied in the premises, because the premises are supposed to provide some grounds for you to believe the conclusion. If you already believe the conclusion, there wouldn't be any argument in the first place. So the premises are supposed to give you something extra, something additional. And if they're not doing that, then you may have this fallacy. Also, look carefully at the premises to discern what would need to be true or accepted in order for the premises themselves to be accepted. If the answer is that the conclusion should be true or accepted, then be on guard against this fallacy. There could be other cases of fallacies that involve that, so I don't want to say automatically that that's going to be begging the question, but you should be on your guard. Now, this leads us to how do you distinguish this from other fallacies, right? And there's two main fallacies that this gets mixed up with. One of these is what we call complex question. When you're asking a complex question, there's assumptions being made in the question. Perfect example of that is, have you quit beating your wife yet, right? If you answer yes, then, why were you beating her in the first place? If you answer no, why are you still beating your wife? Notice there's assumptions being built in there. It kind of looks like begging the question, and if you are the kind of person who tends to use begging the question in the sloppy, late modern, meaning assumptions are being made kind of way, then you will very easily confuse begging the question with complex question. So that's why you want to distinguish them, right? That's why you want to be careful with your terminology. It can also be mistaken for what we call a circular argument. And in a circular argument, the premises are assuming something, they're assuming the truth of the conclusion rather than actually leading to the truth of the conclusion. In order for the premises to be true, the conclusion in some way needs to be granted. There's some circular arrangement going on there. And we're going to talk about that in a separate video, because it is really structurally a different kind of argument. It's similar to begging the question. Some logic textbooks kind of, in my view, non-rigorously lump the two of them together, but structurally they're not quite the same, so we do want to be able to distinguish those. If you're taking a class where the professor, of course, is using one of those textbooks, like, say, Hurley's, for example, well, you better do what the professor wants you to do and classify it that way. But if we're being very exact and rigorous about this, begging the question is something slightly different than a circular argument. Now, not every case where the terms are being restated from the conclusion to the premises are necessarily begging the question. So I don't want you to jump in and automatically assume that if there's been some sort of vocabulary change from one to the other, that is begging the question. If there's something being added in the premises that will support the conclusion, then it's probably going to be, either a good argument on its own face, or there's something else wrong with it, not this wrong with it. Last, how do you avoid falling into this fallacy? When you're engaging in making a case using argument, right, make sure that you're actually providing grounds or reasons for the claim that you're making that are in some way different than the claim that you're trying to get people to accept. Provide premises that are actually different, though having the same, overlap in some degree of terms, than the conclusion, because otherwise you're likely to fall into this. Also, be careful with terminology. Don't allow words to get you all mixed up. Don't allow them to seduce you. Don't use a thesaurus, for example, to try to make arguments. Don't assume that because terms are lexically different that they don't actually refer to the same thing. Sometimes they do. And if you find yourself restating a conclusion and providing some premises as justification, if you've fallen into the fallacy, that is, see if you can provide some independent justification that somebody else who saw the problem with that could accept. See if there's some other way to argue for the point that you want to make. The last thing I'm going to say is that this video is part of an entire series on the informal fallacies, which in turn is part of a much larger channel devoted specifically to critical thinking, logic, and argumentation. So if you enjoy this video, if you enjoy this sort of stuff, come back to the channel, share it with other people, pass it around. This is very helpful stuff, and continue in your own process of becoming a better critical thinker.